A rancher found an Apache girl in his well. She'd been living there for 6 months. Eli Thompson rose before dawn, same as he always did. The silence of the ranch was a thick blanket, broken only by the soft groan of weathered floorboards and the shuffle of his boots. The air out here was cool, sharp with the smell of sagebrush and dry earth. It was a smell he knew better than his own name. He grabbed his pail, his joints complaining in the cold, and walked toward the well. It was a ritual, same as every day. Draw the first water before the sun had a chance to burn the cool from the morning. But this morning was different. Something stopped him dead in his tracks. A length of rope. It dangled over the edge of the well stones, frayed and worn thin. The fibers were almost see-through in places, like they'd been gripped and pulled 1,000 times. He frowned. That wasn't his rope. His bucket rope was coiled neat and proper on its peg by the windlass. This was something else. Cut short. The end was knotted, stiff, almost chewed, like someone had worked it with desperate, clumsy hands. Eli crouched, the dry dirt crunching under his boots. He ran the rough twine between his calloused fingers. It felt wrong. Old, but used recently. That's when his eyes caught it. A small flash of color, wedged in a crack between the stones. A shred of faded calico, torn and dark with grime. He plucked it free, turning it over in the pale, pre-dawn light. It wasn't a piece of a saddle blanket. It wasn't a scrap from a grain sack. It was from a dress. A woman's dress. The hair on the back of his neck stood straight up. A cold dread, colder than the morning air, washed over him. He leaned closer to the mouth of the well, his heart starting a low, heavy drum against his ribs. The water below was a perfect circle of black, a mirror that swallowed the dim light and showed him nothing. And then he heard it. So faint, he almost missed it. It wasn't the plop of a frog or the gentle lapping of water against stone. It was a shift, a breath, the scrape of something soft moving against the rough rock walls. Eli's pulse hammered in his throat. He backed away slowly, his hand reaching for the lantern hooked on the post. His fingers fumbled with the flint and steel, the sparks seeming impossibly loud in the silence. The wick caught. He lifted the lantern, the flame sputtering, and lowered it slowly, carefully, into the shaft. The light swayed, a pendulum of orange against the dark. It pushed the shadows aside as it sank. 10 feet, 15 feet. It slid across slick moss, trickles of water, the rough-hewn stones of the well wall, and then something else. Eyes, wide, unblinking, caught in the lantern's glow. For a single, frozen heartbeat, Eli thought it was an animal, a coyote or a bobcat, trapped and cornered in the dark. But the shape around those eyes, the silhouette that emerged from the shadows, was unmistakable. A face, smeared with dirt and shadow, pressed flat against the stone wall as if trying to will itself invisible. The eyes flickered, darted around in panic, then locked on his, and the fear in them burned. It wasn't the fear of a trapped animal. It was deeper. It was the kind of fear bred from months of hiding in the dark, the kind that expects a blow the moment light finds it. Eli's hand shook, and the lantern nearly slipped from his grasp. His throat was bone dry. There was someone living in his well. The figure shrank back, pulling away from the light, melting deeper into the darkness. But he'd seen enough. The fragile curve of a cheekbone, a mess of tangled black hair, the unmistakable skeletal outline of a girl. His voice came out as a rough, croaking whisper, harsher than he intended. "Who's down there?" Only silence answered him, a heavy, taut silence that stretched and stretched until it was broken by the smallest shivering intake of breath. 2 terrified eyes blinked once in the lantern light, then disappeared completely into the black. Eli stood there for a long time, the lantern rope in his hand, staring into the dark hole in the ground that had suddenly become something terrible. He hadn't just found a girl. He had stumbled into a secret someone was willing to die to keep. Eli didn't sleep that night. He didn't even try. He sat on his porch, his old rifle resting across his knees, the lantern on the rail beside him guttering low. His eyes were fixed on the black circular shape of the well in the yard. The image of those two eyes staring up at him was burned into his mind. Who was she? How did she get down there? And who was she hiding from? Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. The silence of the ranch was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. When the first hint of gray light touched the horizon, he couldn't stand it anymore. The waiting was eating him alive. He took a heavy coil of rope from the barn, one he used for pulling calves out of mud, and tied it securely to the windlass. He braced his worn-out boots against the stone lip of the well, took a deep breath that tasted of dust and fear, and began to lower himself into the cool, damp shaft. The world above disappeared. The smell of moss and wet earth grew stronger with every foot he descended. The air grew cold, 10 feet down, then 15. The light from the lantern he'd hooked to his belt swept across the stones, a moving circle of yellow in a world of black, and then it found her. She was curled into a hollow in the wall he never knew existed, a small alcove just above the waterline. Knees tucked tight to her chest, arms wrapped around herself like a child trying to stay warm. The filthy rags she wore barely qualified as a dress. The fabric was so caked with dirt and grime he couldn't tell what color it had once been. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was matted and stuck to her face in dirty strands. When the lantern light touched her, she flinched so hard her whole body shook, like she'd been struck. "I'm not here to hurt you," Eli said. His voice was low, careful, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. She didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. She just pressed herself harder against the stone, as if she could melt through it and vanish. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. Each one was a visible tremor. He could see the hollows in her cheeks, the sharp, jutting angle of her collarbone where the dress had torn. She hadn't had a proper meal in weeks, maybe months. He knew he couldn't leave her down here. He looped a section of the rope, making a harness. "I'm going to pull you up," he said, his voice soft. "You can't stay down here. You'll die." Still, she said nothing, but her eyes, for the first time, flicked from the lantern to his face, then back again. There was a flicker of something in them. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe calculation. A tiny nod, so small it might have just been the slackening of her muscles from exhaustion, gave him the only permission he was going to get. The climb out was slow, agonizing. She weighed almost nothing. A bundle of bones and shadows held together by a stubborn will to live. When he finally got them over the lip of the well and set her down on the solid earth, she crouched low, one arm thrown over her eyes to shield them from the sudden, blinding brightness of the morning. He offered her a hand to help her stand. She shrank away from his touch, scrambling back a few inches like a cornered animal. Eli stood back, giving her space, and just watched her. He saw the way her bare feet gripped the dirt, the way her gaze darted from his rifle leaning against the porch, to the house, to the distant horizon, as if measuring every possible route of escape. Apache, he thought, the high cheekbones, the straight black hair. She was young, no more than 20, if that. Filthy, half-starved, but there was a pride in the way she held herself, a refusal to bow her head. She gave him nothing, not a word, not a name, just a ragged, rasping silence. And in that silence, a chilling realization settled deep in Eli's bones. He'd been drawing water from this well every single day. He'd stood on this very spot, complaining about the heat, watching the hawks circle overhead. And the whole time, for 6 long months, this girl had been living in the dark belly of the earth right beneath his feet, stealing water by night, maybe slipping into his smokehouse for a scrap of jerky, always hidden, always watching. The real question wasn't how she had survived. The question was what, or who, was so terrifying that a cold, dark hole in the ground felt like the safest place on earth. The girl sat on the edge of the porch, a ghost in the morning light. Her knees were drawn up tight beneath her chin, her bare feet tucked under the hem of her ragged dress. Eli kept his distance, sitting on the top step, not wanting to spook her. The coffee pot sat on the boards between them, its slow, hissing sound filling the tense silence. He poured a steaming cup of black coffee into a tin mug and slid it across the porch to her. She stared at it for a long, long time. Her eyes, dark and hollow, studied the cup as if it might be a trap. Finally, her thin, trembling hand reached out and took it. She lifted it to her lips, sipping the hot liquid like someone who was afraid the gift might be snatched away at any moment. Her voice, when it finally came, was a shock. It was little more than gravel scraping against stone, hoarse from disuse. 6 moons, she whispered. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the far-off mountains. I stay there, in the well. Eli blinked. He was sure he'd misheard. 6 months? She gave a single, sharp nod, her eyes still locked on the horizon. Nobody looked inside, not even you. The words hit him harder than a punch. He thought of every morning he'd hauled up water, complaining about the ache in his back. Every evening he'd passed the well with a bucket in his hand, his mind on his chores. Not once had he ever imagined that a pair of human eyes might be watching him from the shadows below. 6 months. Through the blistering summer heat and the sudden violent autumn storms. Through nights when the coyotes howled so close it sounded like they were in the yard. She had been down there, hidden just beneath his feet. Why? The question came out harsher than he intended. He softened his voice. Why would you choose that hole? Her hands trembled against the warm tin cup, but her gaze was steady now. Safe, she said. She forced the word out as though it was heavy, painful to speak. Soldiers don't climb in wells. Men, they don't look down. Too busy looking out. A sickness churned low in Eli's stomach. He thought of Sheriff Watson. He thought of the councilmen in town, the respectable faces who prided themselves on keeping order in Willowbrook. Men he'd shared a drink with, men he'd traded cattle with. She'd been running from them, or from men just like them, for so long that she knew exactly where their eyes would never wander. She knew they were always looking out for threats, for challenges to their power. They never thought to look down at what they were standing on. He studied her more closely now. The hollows under her eyes weren't just from hunger. There were pale lines on her skin, places where the sun should have darkened it. She hadn't seen daylight in half a year. Every ounce of her energy had been spent on one thing: survival. Sneaking up at night, silent as a ghost, to steal a piece of bread or a strip of jerky from his smokehouse. Lowering herself back into the cold, damp dark before the first hint of dawn. He remembered the times he'd noticed food missing. He'd cursed raccoons, set traps, never once dreaming the thief was a desperate human girl, hiding just inches from his daily life. 6 months, he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. How in God's name did no one notice you? She finally turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were dark, unblinking, and filled with a terrible, ancient knowledge. Nobody want to see, she said softly. So nobody see. Eli sat back, the wood of the porch step pressing into his spine. The truth of her words was as heavy and solid as the well stones. She was right. He hadn't wanted to see. None of them had. It was easier to believe in raccoons than to believe in the kind of cruelty that would drive a young girl into a well. And in that willful blindness, in that comfortable silence, she had survived. But her survival was an accusation, and it was pointed right at him and at everyone in Willowbrook. At first light, the girl was at the pump. Her sleeves were rolled back, and she worked the iron handle with a surprising strength. Water gushed into the basin, cold and clear, splashing over her hands, running down her thin forearms. For a moment, watching her, Eli thought she looked almost ordinary. Just another ranch hand washing the dust of the morning from her skin. Then he saw it, and the world stopped. The scar. It was just above her wrist, a hideous puckered mark burned deep into her flesh. It was rough and uneven, the edges raised where the hot iron had seared her. At a quick glance, you might mistake it for some kind of crude tattoo or ornament. But the edges told the real story. Skin doesn't scar like that by accident. This mark was deliberate. It had been pressed into her while the iron still glowed white-hot. Eli froze where he stood. The breath caught in his throat, hot and sharp. She saw him looking. In an instant, her hands shot down to cover the mark. She tugged her sleeve down, quick and hard, her movements frantic. But it was too late. The image was already seared into Eli's mind. A symbol. A brand. He'd heard whispers. Ugly rumors passed in low voices over whiskey at the saloon, or in the back of Murphy's general store. Talk of apprenticeships, of cheap labor, if you knew who to ask, of strange wagons that arrived in town only on nights when the moon was new and the darkness was absolute. He'd always dismissed them as nonsense. The bitter tales of rivals or stories spun to scare newcomers away. But this wasn't a story. This was living flesh. This was proof he could no longer deny. He took a step closer, his boots crunching in the dirt. The words felt heavy on his tongue, like stones. "What is that?" Her whole body went rigid. She turned her back to him, her hands gripping the cold iron of the pump handle so tightly her knuckles were white. For a long, silent moment he thought she wouldn't answer. He thought she'd retreat back into that wall of silence she'd built around herself. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke a single word. Auction. The word hit him like a physical blow. It knocked the air from his lungs. Auction. Not for horses or cattle, not for hides or tack. For people. His stomach lurched violently. He thought of the tidy rows of pens behind Murphy's store, the ones he'd always assumed were for holding livestock shipments before they were moved on. He thought of the nights he'd ridden past town late and noticed extra wagons parked in the shadows, their heavy canvas pulled tight, never once questioning what or who lay beneath. He thought of the uneasy silence that would sometimes fall over the saloon when certain men gathered at a certain table. All the pieces he had chosen to ignore for years slid into place with a brutal, sickening clarity. She turned to face him now. Her eyes were dark with a pain so deep there were no tears left for it. "They burn you," she said, her voice quiet and dead, "so no one forget who owns you." Eli felt the ground tilt beneath his feet. This wasn't something that happened in some far-off place. This was happening here, in Willowbrook. His neighbors, men he called friends, had done this. It wasn't just rumors. It wasn't just shadows. It was flesh and blood and hot iron. The brand on her arm wasn't just a scar. It was a receipt, a title of ownership. And the transaction had been carried out in his own town, right under his blind, willing eyes. He hadn't just been ignorant. He had been complicit, and that realization was a poison that began to spread through his veins. The road into Willowbrook felt different under Eli's boots. On the surface, nothing had changed. The same dust rose with every step. The same collection of horses stood hitched outside Murphy's general store. The same cluster of men loitered under the awning, trying to escape the punishing sun. But now that Eli knew what to look for, the town spoke a different language. It spoke in the silences. He pushed through the batwing doors of the store. The little bell above the door chimed, just like always. He nodded to Murphy, who was busy behind the counter. Murphy's eyes flicked up, met his for a fraction of a second, then darted away again. Too quickly. Eli asked for flour, beans, and coffee. The usual. Murphy's hands moved with practiced speed, but Eli caught the nervous glance the storekeeper cast toward the back room. He saw the quick, almost invisible tightening of his jaw, as if he was afraid one wrong word might unlock a door and let something rotten crawl out into the light. On the porch outside, two ranchers he'd known for years, Caldwell and Ames, were talking. Their voices weren't loud, but they weren't quiet either. The moment Eli stepped out of the store, they stopped, mid-sentence. The silence was sudden and awkward. Caldwell tipped his hat. "Eli," he said, but the gesture was hollow. It lacked its usual warmth. It was the strained, empty courtesy of a man who is waiting for you to move along so real business can resume. Ames just stared at the ground, refusing to meet his eyes. At the blacksmith's, it was the same story. A pair of fine-looking horses waited to be shod, but no one was claiming them. Just an uneasy quiet, broken only by the rhythmic clang of the hammer on steel. When Eli asked the smith who the horses belonged to, the man shrugged too fast. "Just left 'em for repair," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the glowing metal in his tongs. He didn't look up. He didn't want to engage. He wanted Eli to leave. All through Willowbrook, it was the same small things, as subtle and as telling as dust settling in the wind. Conversations that died the moment he approached. Men who would normally clap him on the shoulder now stepping aside, not out of respect, but out of a cold calculation. Even Sheriff Watson, leaning his chair back against the wall outside his office, didn't give his usual lazy wave. He just watched Eli with a narrow, penetrating squint, a look that carried far more weight than casual indifference. It was a look of assessment, of suspicion. Eli kept walking, every sound sharpening against his ears, the scrape of boots on the boardwalk, the creak of a distant wagon wheel, the low murmur of words he couldn't quite make out. The girl's story, the one she had whispered in broken English by the pump, no longer felt like a confession from another world. It was real. It was right here, woven into the very fabric of his town, and it seemed like everyone was in on it. Everyone was a part of the lie. He paused across the street from the saloon, watching as men filed in. They weren't going in for a midday drink or a game of cards, not this early. Their movements were different. They slipped through the door like shadows, their shoulders hunched, their faces taut with a purpose they didn't want seen. They were going to a meeting that wasn't for public knowledge. A cold weight settled in his gut. Willowbrook wasn't just a town with a few dark corners. It was a place built on a foundation of darkness, a place where decent folk had made a collective choice to look the other way, where pure evil could thrive in broad daylight, so long as no one ever dared to speak its name. And the worst part was, until this morning, he had been one of them. He had been just as blind, just as silent, as all the rest. And now, they could smell the change on him. They knew somehow that he could finally see, and that made him dangerous. The girl sat by the fire, the flames painting flickering shadows across her face. For days, she had spoken only in fragments, short, clipped words, nods, silences that told him more than speech ever could. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the warm stew Eli had coaxed her to eat, or maybe it was the way the night was so still and quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, listening. Her eyes followed the sparks as they rose from the fire, disappearing into the vast, dark sky. Then, without looking at him, she spoke. Her voice was still rough, but clearer now. "Nahimana." Eli paused, the ladle still in his hand. "Is that your name?" She nodded once. Her lips were pressed into a thin, tight line, as though even giving away that small piece of herself was a dangerous risk. He repeated it softly, carefully, as if the name itself was fragile and might break. "Nahimana." A name. Not a ghost. A person. not just a shadow in his well. Her shoulders seemed to slump, as if the weight of that name spoken aloud had finally broken something inside her. And with the name came the rest of the story. It came out in a torrent. Broken words at first, halting English wrapped around the sharp, guttural sounds of the Apache language. Eli didn't understand every word, but the meaning struck him with the force of a physical blow. Her people had been camped near the San Pedro River. Soldiers, she said, but also hired men. Men with hard eyes and no uniforms. They had come at dawn, with rifles and torches. Her father had fallen early, trying to defend the camp. Her mother was dragged, screaming, into the dust. Her brothers and sisters were scattered, some cut down where they stood, others captured and bound. Nahimana herself had been tied, her hands raw from the ropes, and shoved into a wagon with others from her tribe, all of them marked for the same destination, an auction. Her voice faltered as she spoke, but she forced it on. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, as though she could see her family's faces there in the dancing light. Eli just listened, his own food forgotten. Each word she spoke drove a nail of shame deeper into his soul. He had suspected pieces of it, but hearing it all laid bare left him feeling hollowed out, sickened. She told him of nights locked inside the wagon, the air thick with the stink of fear and sweat. Iron bars had been bolted over the slats. Men on horseback rode alongside them, their faces illuminated by lantern light, watching them like livestock. But somewhere on the trail, between Willowbrook and the next town, desperation had given her a chance. A wheel had snapped on the rough terrain. The wagon pitched violently, throwing everyone against the walls. In the confusion, with the guards distracted, she had managed to wriggle through a broken plank in the floor. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. She ran with the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears, certain that every shadow held a pursuer. When her strength was completely gone, when she could run no more, she stumbled upon his ranch. She had only meant to get a drink of water from the well, but the darkness inside it had seemed safer than the open ground. So she climbed down, curled herself into the cold stones, and did not come out again. Days bled into weeks, weeks bled into months. Her entire existence was reduced to the barest elements of survival: stolen food, sips of water, the scrape of her fingernail against the rock to mark the passing of another sun. Eli sat back, the firelight flickering against his grim face. The weight of her story pressed down on him, heavier than any winter storm, heavier than any war he'd ever heard of. Nahimana had survived by making herself invisible, by vanishing. And in doing so, she had forced him to finally see the world he was living in. Her name wasn't just a name. It carried the memory of her people. And it carried a truth he could no longer turn away from. His quiet life on the ranch was over. He just didn't know what was going to come next. The knock came just as Eli was mending a gatepost. 3 short, sharp raps on the wooden frame of the porch. It was too firm to be a friendly neighbor stopping by for a chat. It was too casual to be urgent trouble. It was something else, something calculated. Eli set down his hammer and straightened up, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He stepped toward the house, his gut already tightening. Sheriff Watson stood there, his hat pulled low against the morning sun. A smile that didn't come anywhere near his cold eyes was plastered across his face. "Morning, Eli," the sheriff said, tipping the brim of his hat a fraction of an inch. "Heard tell you've had some trouble with raccoons lately. Thought I'd ride out, see how you're faring." Eli's jaw clenched. Raccoons. He hadn't mentioned raccoons to a single soul in months, not since the food had first started disappearing. The sheriff wasn't here by chance. This was a message. Eli forced a nod. "Got it under control, Sheriff." Watson's gaze drifted past him, his eyes methodically sweeping across the yard. His look lingered on the water pump, on the neatly stacked woodpile. Then it stopped, cold and hard, on the well. He didn't say a word about it, but his eyes narrowed just enough to send Eli's pulse climbing. Strange business these days, Watson went on, his voice as smooth and lazy as creek water. Some folks in the territory have lost property. Priceless, you might say. Hard to put a dollar value on it, but they're mighty keen to have it back. He rubbed his chin, studying Eli like a poker player waiting for a tell. Eli kept his face a perfect mask of stone. Property, you say? Can't say I've heard anything about that. Watson smiled again. It was a thin, knowing smile that made Eli's skin crawl. That's the way of things, isn't it? Some matters don't reach every ear. But when valuable property goes missing, it has a funny way of showing up where a man least expects it. Wells, barns, cellars, you just never know what might be hiding in the dark. The words hung heavy in the air between them. An unspoken threat. Eli felt the atmosphere shift, crackling with what wasn't being said. He knew Nahimana was inside the house. She would be crouched near the back window, every muscle in her body tensed, listening to every single word. She would have heard the horses arrive. She knew who this was. The sheriff adjusted his gun belt, his eyes flicking one last time to the well. He let the silence stretch out, drawing it tight like a wire. Then he chuckled softly, a dry, rasping sound. Anyhow, just figured I'd let you know. If you happen to see anything unusual, you'll be sure to let me know. Folks in this town are counting on me to keep order. Wouldn't do for things to slip through the cracks. Eli nodded once, his mouth as dry as dust. You'll be the first to hear, Sheriff. Watson touched the brim of his hat again, turned, and mounted his horse with a practiced, easy grace. He rode off, the dust from his horse's hooves curling in the hot, still air. Eli stood rooted to the spot, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sheriff wasn't guessing. He knew. Or at least, he suspected enough to come out here and deliver the warning in person. This wasn't a courtesy call. It was an ultimatum. Watson knew Nahimana was here, under Eli's protection. And it was only a matter of time before he came back. Next time, he wouldn't be bringing polite conversation. He'd be bringing chains. The evening sun was bleeding red across the horizon when Eli found Nahimana by the pump. She had her sleeve rolled up again. She was scrubbing at her arm with a wet rag, scrubbing at the brand as though enough water and friction could wash away the scar that was burned into her flesh. The sight of it, raw and ugly in the fading light, gnawed at him. He could no longer keep the questions locked behind his teeth. He had to know. He had to know everything. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm, leaving no room for evasion. That brand, he said. I need to know what it means. All of it. She froze, her thin shoulders rising with a short, shallow breath. For a long time she didn't move or speak. She just let the pump handle fall back with a hollow clatter against the iron casing. Finally, she lifted her gaze to his. In the dim light, her eyes looked ancient, filled with a sorrow that was older than her years. They sell, she said. Her words were broken but sharp as glass, like cattle, like horses, people. Eli's throat tightened. Where? Her lips pressed into a thin white line, then parted with a tremor. Behind Murphy's store. There are pens, like for stock. The wooden rails are built high, so no one can see inside. Her voice grew quieter, more strained. At night they come, wagons with heavy canvas covers, men with lanterns. She swallowed hard, her free hand gripping her sleeve until her knuckles shone white. They put us inside. They write our names in a book. She shook her head. No, not names. Numbers. The numbers are burned here. She touched the scar with two shaking fingers. A ledger. It keeps who buys, who sells. The sheriff. He counts the money. Eli's gut twisted into a knot of ice and fire. He had walked past those pens 100 times, 1,000 times. He had nodded to Murphy over the counter, trading his money for flour and salt, never once thinking that the tall wooden boards hid more than livestock. Now the picture sharpened in his mind with horrifying clarity. The heavy wagons arriving after dark, the late-night meetings at the saloon, the sudden, unexplained prosperity of certain men in town. It was all connected. It was all part of the same monstrous machine. Nahimana's voice faltered, but she forced the words out. Each one seemed to cut her raw. If they find me, they take me back. They will chain me, sell me again. Maybe north, maybe south. It doesn't matter. Different hands, same chains. Her breath hitched, the first crack in the steady, emotionless tone she had used. A single, desperate plea broke through. Please! Eli looked at her. He truly looked at her. At the scar that would never fade. At the hollow, haunted strength in her eyes. At the way her entire body trembled, even as she tried to hold herself proud and straight. She wasn't asking for his pity. She was begging for her life. He felt the heavy weight of his rifle back in the house. He thought of the dusty old chest in his bedroom, and in that chest, under a pile of old blankets, a tarnished badge he hadn't looked at in years. He remembered the oath he had taken, an oath he had buried, along with the man he used to be, for the sake of a quiet, peaceful life. That peace was gone now. It had been shattered by her voice, and by the truth that was burned into her arm. I won't let them take you, Eli said. The promise sounded heavier than iron on his tongue. It was a vow. And for the first time since he had pulled her from the dark, Nahimana let her eyes close. A single tear escaped and slid down her dusty cheek, as though his words had finally cracked something open inside her that she could no longer hold shut. In that moment, Eli knew he had crossed a line. He had made his choice, and it was a choice that was going to get him killed. The sun had barely lifted above the eastern hills when the sound reached him. The crunch of many hooves and the groan of wagon wheels on the dry dirt road. Eli set his coffee cup aside, his hand instinctively brushing against the stock of the rifle he'd left leaning by the door. He'd been expecting this, praying it wouldn't come, but expecting it all the same. Dust rose on the road. Out of it, 5 riders emerged, their shapes dark against the bright morning sun. Sheriff Watson was in the lead, riding tall. A heavy coil of chains was slung over his saddle horn. Behind him trailed Murphy, the storekeeper, and Caldwell, the rancher, and 2 more men whose faces were hard and grim. All of them were armed. This wasn't a group of concerned neighbors. This was a posse, and they had come with only one purpose. Watson dismounted slowly, his boots thudding heavily on the packed dirt. "Morning, Eli," he drawled, but the courtesy was thin and rang hollow. He swung the length of chain from his saddle horn, letting the links rattle against the ground with a sound like a snake. "We've come for what's ours. The Carver estate lost some property a few months back. Word is, it found its way out here." Murphy spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, his eyes cutting toward the house. "A girl, an Apache girl, branded stock. She belongs to the Carvers, by law." Eli felt a hot tide of rage rise in his chest, so powerful he struggled to keep it from showing on his face. He stepped down from the porch, deliberately placing himself square between them and the doorway where he knew Nahimana was standing, just out of sight. "There's no law in this land that makes a person property." Caldwell's hand drifted down, resting on the butt of his revolver. His lips curled into a sneer. "Don't play dumb with us, Eli. You know how it works in this territory. Always has." The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. The men shifted their weight, their boots grinding against the gravel. Watson's gaze was steady, as hard and unforgiving as a steel trap. "Step aside, Eli," he said, his voice dropping low. "We ain't here to kill no one, unless you force us, but that girl is coming with us, one way or another." Eli's heart pounded in his chest. Duty. A word he hadn't thought about in years. It pressed against his ribs. The oath he'd taken when that badge was pinned to his chest so long ago. The oath he had buried, hoping to blend in, to live a quiet life. He could taste the metallic tang of fear at the back of his throat, but it was being drowned out by something stronger, something hotter. He saw the scar on Nahimana's arm in his mind's eye. He heard her voice cracking as she begged him not to let them chain her again. His hand closed around the smooth wood of his rifle. Slowly, deliberately, he levered it up into the crook of his arm, the barrel pointed at the ground, but ready. She isn't going anywhere. The words hit the air like a flint striking steel. In a blur of motion, Caldwell's revolver cleared its leather, the metal gleaming in the morning light. In the same breath, Eli lifted his rifle, his cheek pressed against the stock, every muscle in his body coiled and tight. The world narrowed to the front sight of his gun, to the space between him and the men who had come to drag a girl back into hell. The yard went dead silent. The only sound was the faint, dry rattle of the chain links in Watson's hand, swaying back and forth like a serpent waiting to strike. The morning held the weight of a final choice, and Eli knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it could only end one way, with blood in the dust. The standoff broke not with a gunshot, but with a low thunder that rolled over the ridge behind the house. Hoofbeats, dozens of them. All heads, Eli's included, snapped toward the sound. A long line of riders appeared against the bright morning sun, dust pluming at their heels. They were moving fast, blue coats, rifles held at the ready, the glint of federal badges catching the light. The men from Willowbrook shifted uneasily, their guns half raised, their eyes darting between Eli and the rapidly approaching column of soldiers. Watson's jaw tightened into a hard knot. "What in the hell is this?" he demanded, but the answer was already there, written in the cold steel resolve on Eli Thompson's face. Eli took a single step forward, his rifle still leveled at Watson's chest. His voice cut through the tense air, sharp and clear. "My name's not just Eli Thompson. It's Marshal Eli Thompson, United States Marshal, and I've been sworn to root out the sickness you've been hiding under your neighbors' noses." He reached into his coat, pulled free the tarnished, star-shaped badge he had kept buried for 5 long years, and pinned it against his vest. The sunlight caught on it like a flare. "This is done." The Federals swept into the yard, their horses fanning out, surrounding the sheriff and his men with a practiced, deadly efficiency. Iron clicked as rifle hammers were cocked all around them, a sound that carried more weight than any shouted threat. Murphy's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no words came out. Caldwell's gun, which had seemed so menacing just moments before, sagged in his hand before he let it fall to the dirt with a soft thud. Only Watson stood rigid, the chains still coiled in his grip, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, but his eyes betrayed the first cracks of fear. A marshal with captain's bars on his shoulders dismounted, nodding curtly to Eli before turning his gaze to the doorway of the house. Nahimana trembled, but she did not hide. Slowly, with a steadiness born of a deep and defiant courage, she stepped out from the shadows of the house and into the open. Her sleeve was pushed back. She held her arm out, exposing the ugly, puckered scar for all of them to see. The brand, the symbol of her slavery, caught the morning light, raw and unmistakable. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass. Then the lead marshal turned, his voice ringing out clear and final. "Evidence enough." The men of Willowbrook shuffled their feet as the chains they had brought for a girl were taken from Watson's saddle. One by one, heavy iron cuffs closed around their wrists. The same steel they had meant for others now bit into their own flesh. The shackles clanked with a heavy, final sound as they were bound together under the rising sun. Eli lowered his rifle at last, the breath leaving his lungs in a long, slow, steady stream. He looked at Nahimana. She stood straight and tall, no longer hidden in shadow or stone, no longer just a whisper in the dark. The scar on her arm bore witness to the horrors she had endured, but her eyes, steady and unflinching, told the greater truth. She had survived. As the prisoners were led away, their protests and curses swallowed by the dust kicked up by the horses, a new silence settled over the ranch. A clean silence. And in that silence, Nahimana stepped forward into the full light of day, not as prey, not as property, but as proof. Proof that even in the heart of all that rot, the truth could still rise and stand unbroken. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything.